Welcome to the lecture for Research Methods. We'll be talking about the second half of Chapter 4 of the APA manual. So, more mechanics of writing type stuff. Starting off with capitalization, some basic stuff. Obviously, capitalize the beginning of a sentence, right? But then also titles of books and articles. When writing about them in text, the rules are a little different than when you write about them in your reference page. So be sure and pay attention to the rules for capitalization regarding kind of titles of books, articles, movies, magazines, what have you. One thing kind of particular to our population, I know it's Army policy, and a couple years ago they passed this decision down to capitalize the word soldier, regardless of where it was in the sentence. And when you're writing for the Army, then it makes sense to use their style rules, but that would be inconsistent with APA's style rules. So that would be considered an APA error if you're writing about soldiers in a paper. One thing that see a lot of people write about disorders, like schizophrenia or bipolar 1 disorder, major depressive disorder, they tend to capitalize those things, and they don't need to be capitalized. And then in the method section, there are a couple things that may come up that are just a little squirrely, kind of unique capitalization stuff you won't see elsewhere. For example, you have a phrase like, on day 2 of experiment 4, now we've got day capitalized and experiment capitalized. So, and these are things that I say don't bother trying to memorize, but when you get to the method section and you're writing about aspects of your study, go back and look what the APA manual says about capitalization, because there's some weird rules there. For italicization, you italicize titles of books, movies, articles. Again, this is when in the text. The rules are slightly different for the reference page if you're going to italicize a title or not. But if you reference something, if you refer to something in the text, then it's a title. It's italicized. If it's in the reference page, well, you have to pay attention to the rules for the reference page. If there's some technical term that you're introducing, you italicize it, but only the first time you use it. It's kind of telling the reader, hey, here's this new term. I'm italicizing it. And then after that, you don't have to continue italicizing it. And if it's not a technical term, and it's more slang, then it's not italics. It's quotation marks around it. Right? The other thing that you'll probably going to see, I'm probably going to use, would be italicization when writing about the anchors of a scale, right? Some kind of Likert type scale, right? So usually in the method section. So if you have something like participants rated the degree to which they agreed with proposed agenda items using a scale that ranged from 1, not all agree, to 5, completely agree. So the stuff inside the parentheses is italicized. The numbers aren't, but the anchors, which is what goes inside the parentheses, are italicized. And you don't have to list every, like 1, this, 2, this, 3, this. Typically, you just do the anchors or the endpoints. The lowest possible thing they could say and the highest thing they could say. Abbreviations. Overall, when deciding whether or not you should abbreviate something, two kind of guiding thoughts. One, you abbreviate if it's something that's conventionally abbreviated. So if everywhere you read it they're using an abbreviation, then you go ahead and use an abbreviation. It's an accepted convention, like MMPI2 for the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory, right? PTSD, CBT for cognitive behavioral therapy. And the other thing, if it's something that maybe isn't used a lot, maybe it's a term you're introducing, you have to think, okay, well, will I save a lot of space by abbreviating? I don't want to abbreviate, short phrases. If it's a 3-word phrase and all those words are, 4 letters long, abbreviation isn't going to save me that much space. So will it save me space? And then also, will it help me prevent cumbersome repetition? If I had to say, the items on the Minnesota Multiphasic Inventory indicate da-da-da, and on scale 7 of the Minnesota Multiphasic Inventory, when you can imagine the reader going, oh, okay, I know what that is. I don't have to read the whole word. The abbreviation is fine. So if it would be cumbersome not to abbreviate, then abbreviate. But things like sometimes I think people abbreviate African American, AA. That's not a long phrase, and it's not that cumbersome to say the African American participants. They don't need to be the AA participants. And that the AA participants can actually be somewhat confusing because AA is a common abbreviation for Alcoholics Anonymous, which again is an example there of something that's short, but there is a conventional abbreviation. If you do decide to abbreviate, the first time you use an abbreviation, you should be sure and write out the entire phrase that's being abbreviated, right? And then immediately following the written out entire phrase should be the abbreviation inside parentheses. Okay. An example here, clients diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, well, that's a typo, should be WERE, were more likely to whatever. And then from then on, I can just use PTSD after I've done it that first time. Other thing, common Latin abbreviations. There are a couple of them, but there's two that you'll probably use more than any others. IE, Latin for id, abbreviation for the Latin id est, or that is. And you use IE when you put a word or a phrase in parentheses that clarifies the previous phrase or sentence. Doesn't give an example. It's a clarification. So blah blah. That is. I'm trying to say. Okay. So you might think about it. That's the phrase I use sometimes to make sure I use the right thing. What I mean to say is. Right. So that is. So example here. When discussing the typical response of teenagers, i.e., rebellion. So here I'm clarifying that the typical response of teenagers is rebellion. It's not an example of typical responses. It is what I'm thinking the typical response is. Right. So I'm clarifying some other maybe more vague phrase that preceded it. Okay. And then the other one, e.g., right, abbreviation for exempla gratia, Latin for example. Use obviously when you give an example of something identified in the previous phrase or sentence. So here we have when discussing the typical responses of teenagers, e.g. rebellion. So now I'm saying that rebellion is it's an example of some set of responses. I'm not clarifying what the response is or what the responses are as if there's some defined set. I'm just giving here's some, could be more. Okay. The other thing you'll use probably a lot of, especially in the method section, would be scientific abbreviations. And I won't go through all those here, but just look at table 4.4 for how to abbreviate any scientific abbreviations, obviously. Use of numbers. And the big thing here is when you have a number, should it be used in numeral form or in word form? Generally, expressed in numbers if the number is 10 or higher. Right, so there were 13 possible responses here. Any number that appears in the abstract, if it's above 10, if it's below 10, if it's in the abstract, should be in numeral form. And that's because the abstract is a place where you're trying to save space, and obviously numbers take up less space when you write them in numeral format. If it precedes a unit of measurement, right, so 3 centimeters, 4 seconds, whatever, however big the number is, if it's paired with some unit of measurement, it's abbreviated. It's a numeral. Mathematical functions, so 4 times as often, 3%, things like that. Dates, ages, scores, points on a scale, numerals. So we say the number 1. When you say the number 1, it shouldn't be O and E. It should be the numeral 1. And then exact sums of money and time. And that one's a little squirrely because if you have an approximate amount of time, so we say participants found out about the study about 12 months ago. Well, now that, I'm sorry, not 12, about 6 months ago. It's an approximate amount of time. The number is less than 10, so it would be in word rather than numeral. But if they found out exactly 6 months ago, then it would be in numeral format. So here's an example combining a couple of these things. So when 12 of the 4-year-old participants, so 12 is a numeral because it's greater than 10, 4 because it's age, indicated they need 3 times as much, so 3 times is a mathematical function, 3 times as much time to finish the survey, they were told that 5 minutes remained. So 5 is an amount of time, and it's also preceding a unit of measurement, right? And remember, min is the abbreviation for minute. So you have several examples in that one sentence. Sometimes they're expressed in words. if the number is at the beginning of a sentence. So if your sentence begins 12 participants, or 500 participants were recruited, you're supposed to make it a word. But APA says try not to do that. Try to reword the sentence so that a number doesn't appear at the beginning. But if you can't, then it's in word format. And then if you have common fractions, half, a third, but probably not a tenth. So fractions that we use in kind of everyday language can be written in words. Example here, 12 of the participants indicated they need a third as much time to finish the survey. And sometimes you'll have a combination of numbers written in words and written as numerals, and especially if you have back-to-back modifiers, so you have two numbers back-to-back. And when you do that, the first one's a word, the second one's a numeral. So when 12-year-old participants, you wouldn't have 1, 2, 1, 2 because it would be confusing. So if they're both going to be, or if they both should be numerals, then you make the first one a word. Okay, in terms of metrication, pretty simple. Use the metric system. So we agreed to measure things in meters and centimeters and not in inches and feet. And if you happen to measure it in inches or feet, convert it to the metric system before writing about it. You can check out all the statistical abbreviations in table 4.5, and just make sure whenever you have statistical abbreviations, if it's any kind of sample statistic, the mean of the sample, the number of people in the sample, whatever, it should be italicized. And if it's a population parameter, right, the average of the population, then you use a Greek symbol and you don't italicize. But a couple of examples of things you might end up putting in a paper. When writing about the entire sample, so the sample was comprised of, so I have N of 200. That's my symbol for the entire sample is a capital N. But I'm talking about some portion of my sample. So, those persons who completed the survey under 30 minutes, N equals 15, that means that there weren't 15 people in my study, but I'm talking about some subset. So 15 of those individuals. How many people in a group? It's lowercase n. When writing about statistical tests, here's an example of a commonly used one, analysis of variance. So an analysis of variance, ANOVA, was conducted. So again, follow the kind of same rules of abbreviation and capitalization. Here's an example of writing about a t-test. So you want to include, obviously, the mean and standard deviation for a group. So the leaders, mean of 79, standard deviation of 11, express higher levels of need for competence, then did the randomly selected students. You have their mean, standard deviation, and then when you have the statistical statement that reports the test, comma, t, which is the type of test I'm doing, right? Inside parentheses, my degrees of freedom, the value, the p-value, and some people just put p less than 0.05, less than 0.1, whatever they set their alpha at, but it's preferred to put the exact p-value that was calculated by the statistical software that you used. And then optionally, you can put in here one tail telling you what type of t-test it is. I could have put that earlier in the paper, said one tail t-test would be conducted, and then last is an effect size, which is something fairly new, where there's more pressure, it's more strongly suggested that you include effect sizes when reporting statistical results and not just the p-value. And you notice there's all the abbreviations which you can see in the table, and they're all italicized because they're all statistics. And I think that's about it for now. Take care.